At 61, Margaret Hale had no home, no family savings, and nowhere left to go. After her husband's debts surfaced, the bank took the only house she had ever known. Everything she couldn't fit inside her aging station wagon was left behind. Friends suggested shelters. Some quietly wondered if this was simply how her story would end. But Margaret refused to believe that losing a house meant losing a life. Instead of spending her last $200 on a motel room or a small apartment deposit, she did something that made absolutely no sense. She bought a forgotten maple farm. The trees hadn't produced maple syrup in years. The old sugar house was falling apart. The fields were overgrown. Locals said the land had been cursed by drought decades ago. One man even laughed and told her, "You'll have better luck squeezing syrup from fence posts." For days, Margaret worked alone, clearing brush and hauling away broken branches, trying to breathe life back into a farm everyone else had already given up on. Then, late one evening, as she stood outside the abandoned sugar house, she heard something that shouldn't have been possible. Water. Not rain, not the wind. Running water. The sound was faint, as if it were coming from somewhere deep beneath the ground. Every official record claimed the farm's spring had dried up more than 60 years earlier. So, who or what was still making that sound? Before we discover what Margaret found hidden beneath the old maple farm, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What time is it where you are right now? Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how many different places around the world come together to share these stories. If you're listening in the morning, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. If it's evening where you are, I hope this story helps you relax after a long day. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden family legacies, and second chances that can change a life, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Now, let's go back to the day Margaret Hale lost everything and unknowingly found the place that would become her true home. The sheriff's deputy waited beside the front porch while Margaret Hale folded the last sweater she owned into a cardboard box that had already begun to lose its shape. At 61, she moved carefully. Not because she was weak, but because every object she picked up carried the weight of another memory she would never bring back. The kitchen table where her daughter had done homework, the rocking chair her late husband had built during their first summer in the house, the maple cabinet they had refinished together after moving in more than 30 years earlier. None of it belonged to her anymore. When Harold died unexpectedly 2 years before, Margaret believed the hardest part of her life was over. She had mourned quietly, sold what she could, and continued paying the bills exactly as they always had. Only months later did she discover that Harold had borrowed heavily against the house during the final years of his illness. He had hidden every letter from the bank, hoping he would recover before anyone found out. He never did. By the time Margaret learned the truth, the debt had grown beyond anything she could repay. The foreclosure papers arrived one rainy afternoon. The eviction notice followed 3 weeks later. Now the house stood almost empty, its walls echoing with silence. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale," the deputy said gently as she carried the final box toward her aging station wagon. "Take all the time you need." Margaret smiled politely. None of this was his fault. She placed the box beside 2 worn blankets, a small suitcase, a coffee thermos, and a photo album that had somehow survived every difficult season of her life. Everything else would stay behind. Before closing the front door for the last time, she rested one hand against the old wooden frame. "Thank you," she whispered to the house. Then she locked it, placed the key inside the mailbox as instructed, and walked away without looking back. For the next several nights, the station wagon became her home. She parked near a quiet lakeside park where overnight parking was permitted, folding the back seats flat just enough to stretch out beneath a blanket. The mornings were the hardest. Condensation covered the windows. Her back ached from sleeping awkwardly. Still, she reminded herself that she was safe. Safe was enough for now. Margaret spent each day searching bulletin boards, community centers, and newspaper listings for affordable housing. Every apartment required deposits she couldn't afford. Every small rental disappeared before she could call. Her savings dwindled until only $200 remained inside her checking account. One afternoon, while reading notices posted outside the county agricultural office, a faded auction flyer caught her attention. County land auction. Most properties listed were abandoned storage lots or neglected farmland. Near the bottom of the page, one description stood out. Forgotten Maple Farm. Minimum bid $200. Margaret frowned. She vaguely remembered hearing about the old maple farm years ago. Families had once visited every spring to watch maple syrup being made. But the place had closed long before Harold became ill. She had no experience farming. She knew almost nothing about maple trees. Yet she found herself driving toward the auction the following morning. Only a small crowd gathered beneath a white tent outside the county courthouse. Farmers examined equipment catalogs while investors quietly discussed property values. When the maple farm appeared on the list, several people exchanged amused smiles. "That place hasn't produced syrup in decades," one man muttered. Another chuckled. "The spring dried up before my kids were born." The auctioneer adjusted his glasses. "Opening bid! $200. Silence settled across the crowd. Margaret looked down at the envelope holding every dollar she had left. Common sense told her to keep driving, find another motel, and continue searching for work. But something inside her refused to spend her last savings on one more temporary solution. Slowly, she raised her hand. The auctioneer blinked. $200. He glanced around the crowd. "Any higher bids?" Nobody spoke. A woman near the front quietly shook her head as though feeling sorry for her. The gavel came down with a single sharp crack. "Sold!" The paperwork took less than 15 minutes. Margaret accepted the folded deed and tucked it carefully inside her purse. As she walked toward her station wagon, she heard someone behind her laugh softly. "Poor woman, just bought herself a forest full of dead trees." Another voice answered. "She'll be lucky if she gets enough firewood to earn her money back." Margaret climbed into the driver's seat without responding. An hour later, she turned onto a narrow gravel road leading into the hills. Weathered wooden posts marked the entrance to the forgotten maple farm. Tall grass covered the lane. The old sugar house leaned slightly to one side beneath a rusted tin roof. Beyond it, hundreds of towering maple trees stretched across the hillside, their leaves glowing softly beneath the afternoon sun. The farm looked neglected, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt as though it had simply been waiting. Margaret stepped out of the car and stood quietly, listening to the wind moving through the branches. Somewhere behind the rows of maple trees, an old pickup truck came to a stop. An elderly man climbed out and watched her for a long moment before speaking. "You must be the new owner." Margaret nodded. "I'm Margaret Hale." The man tipped his cap. "Eli Turner." His eyes drifted toward the thick woods beyond the sugar house before returning to hers. After a brief silence, he spoke in a voice barely louder than the breeze. "If you ever hear running water," he paused, "don't ignore it." Margaret stood quietly beside her station wagon as the elderly man climbed the last few steps toward the farmhouse. He moved slowly but confidently, as though he had walked these paths hundreds of times before. His flannel jacket was faded with age, and the brim of his cap had softened from years beneath the sun. "Eli Turner," he repeated, extending a weathered hand. Margaret shook it warmly. "I appreciate you stopping by." Eli glanced across the hillside where rows of towering maple trees stretched toward the edge of the forest. "Most folks don't," Margaret smiled. "You mean after someone buys an abandoned farm?" A faint grin crossed his face. "After someone buys this one." Before she could ask another question, he looked toward the woods again. "Well, I'll let you get settled." He climbed back into his pickup and drove away, leaving only the sound of gravel beneath his tires. Margaret watched until the truck disappeared around the bend. His final words echoed in her thoughts. "If you ever hear running water, don't ignore it." She looked around. Everything seemed perfectly still. Only the wind whispered through thousands of maple leaves. Turning back toward the farmhouse, she pushed open the sagging front door. Dust covered nearly every surface. The kitchen cupboards stood open and empty. A rusted wood stove occupied one corner, while cobwebs stretched across the ceiling beams. Upstairs, 2 small bedrooms overlooked the hillside. Rain had leaked through one section of the roof, staining the floorboards, but the structure itself still felt solid. "I've lived in worse places," Margaret whispered with a tired smile. At least tonight she wouldn't be sleeping inside her station wagon. She spent the rest of the afternoon opening windows, sweeping years of dust onto the porch, and carrying broken furniture outside. By sunset, one downstairs room was clean enough to roll out her blankets. It wasn't much. But for the first time in weeks, she had 4 walls around her. The following morning, she woke before sunrise to birds singing outside the cracked kitchen window. The farm looked different beneath the golden morning light. Neglected, certainly, but not lifeless. After heating water for instant coffee over a small camping stove, she began exploring the property. She expected to find rows of dead maple trees exactly as everyone at the auction had described. Instead, she noticed something surprising. Many of the largest trees looked remarkably healthy. Their trunks were thick and sturdy. Fresh leaves filled the upper branches. A few broken limbs had fallen over the years, but the trees themselves showed every sign of continuing to grow. "If there's no water," she murmured, looking around the hillside, "how are you still alive?" The question lingered as she walked farther into the grove. Here and there she found old sap buckets hanging crookedly from rusted hooks. Most had fallen long ago, swallowed by weeds. Others still clung stubbornly to the trunks as though waiting for another spring harvest. Near midday, the familiar sound of an engine drifted up the gravel road. Eli climbed out of his pickup carrying a toolbox and several long cedar boards. "Thought I'd check whether your roof had collapsed overnight," he joked. Margaret laughed for the first time in days. "Still standing." Eli nodded toward the sugar house, the weathered building where maple sap had once been boiled into syrup. "Mind if we take a look?" Inside, the old evaporator sat beneath layers of dust. Several roof panels had loosened, allowing sunlight to spill across the wooden floor. Eli climbed a ladder with surprising ease for a man his age and secured the worst of the loose boards while Margaret handed him nails and tools. "You don't have to do this," she called up. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I hate watching old buildings give up." By afternoon, the roof no longer rattled in the breeze. It wasn't fully repaired, but it would survive the coming rains. Before leaving, Eli walked behind the sugar house and stopped beside a shallow depression running through the grass. Margaret joined him. "What is it?" she asked. used to be a water channel. She looked more closely. Beneath years of weeds lay carefully stacked stones, forming a narrow trench that disappeared downhill. It carried water, Eli nodded. Long ago. From where? He shrugged. That's the question folks stopped asking. Margaret followed the stone channel for nearly 50 yards before thick brush swallowed it completely. She knelt and brushed away leaves from one section. The stones had been placed with remarkable care. Someone had invested countless hours building the narrow waterway. It made no sense if the farm had truly lost its water source decades earlier. That evening, Margaret drove into town for groceries. While paying for bread and canned soup at the small general store, an elderly woman smiled warmly from the next checkout line. "You're the lady who bought the maple farm." Margaret smiled back. News travels fast. Small towns are like that. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Brooks. "When I was a little girl, families came from 3 counties away for the Maple Festival." Margaret looked surprised. There was a festival? Eleanor laughed softly. Every spring, music, wagons, children chasing each other between the trees. Folks said no maple syrup tasted sweeter. Her smile slowly faded. Then one year, it all stopped. "Why?" Margaret asked. Eleanor hesitated, as though searching through memories that had grown dim with time. Finally, she shook her hand. "People always said the spring dried up." She gently squeezed Margaret's arm before leaving. But sometimes, stories become simpler than the truth. Darkness settled over the farm that night. Margaret sat on the farmhouse porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to crickets sing beneath a sky crowded with stars. The air felt peaceful in a way she hadn't experienced since before Harold became ill. She was about to go inside when something caught her attention. At first, she thought it was the wind. Then she listened more carefully. Somewhere beyond the sugar house, very faintly, she heard the unmistakable sound of water flowing through stone. Margaret remained perfectly still on the porch, holding her breath as the faint sound drifted through the cool night air once more. It wasn't loud. In fact, if a breeze had been blowing through the trees, she might never have noticed it at all. But the evening was calm. The only sounds should have been crickets and rustling leaves. Instead, somewhere beyond the old sugar house, water seemed to be moving gently over stone. Eli's warning returned to her almost word for word. If you ever hear running water, don't ignore it. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and stepped carefully across the yard. The beam swept over tall grass, old maple trunks, and weathered fence posts before reaching the sugar house. The sound grew no louder. It simply lingered at the edge of hearing, impossible to locate with certainty. Margaret circled the building slowly, pausing every few steps. At one point, she was certain the water lay somewhere behind the woods. A few moments later, it seemed to come from beneath the hillside itself. She switched off the flashlight and listened again. Silence. Only insects filled the darkness now. After another 10 minutes of searching, she reluctantly returned to the farmhouse. Perhaps she had imagined it. Yet the sound had seemed so real that sleep came only after midnight. At first light, she returned to the same spot behind the sugar house. Everything appeared ordinary. The stone-lined trench Eli had shown her the day before disappeared beneath weeds exactly as she remembered. Kneeling beside it, she brushed away more dirt with her hands. The stones were beautifully fitted together without mortar, forming a narrow channel just wide enough for water to pass through. Dry leaves covered the bottom. No moisture remained. Still, Someone had built this channel for an important reason. She followed it farther than before, cutting through patches of brush with a pair of pruning shears. The trench curved gently toward the edge of the forest before vanishing beneath years of fallen branches. There, she found another surprise. Half buried beneath moss rested a flat stone marker carved with a small maple leaf. The carving matched nothing she had seen elsewhere on the farm, yet it looked intentional rather than decorative. She photographed it before continuing her search. By midday, she decided she needed someone who understood the land better than she did. The county ranger station sat less than 20 minutes away. Inside, maps covered nearly every wall, showing forests, streams, hiking trails, and protected wetlands. Ranger Owen Price greeted her with an easy smile. "How's the old maple farm treating you?" Margaret laughed softly. "It's giving me puzzles." She explained the strange sound she had heard and described the abandoned stone channel running across the property. Owen listened carefully before walking toward a large cabinet filled with rolled survey maps. After searching for several minutes, he spread a detailed geological map across a wide table. "Here's your property," he said, pointing toward the hillside. Blue lines marked streams throughout the valley, but none crossed the maple farm. "According to every survey we've got, there hasn't been a natural spring there for over 60 years. Margaret frowned. "Then why are those trees still so healthy?" Owen studied the map again. "That's exactly what always puzzled me." He pulled another folder from the shelf, this one containing older reports. Several pages described severe drought conditions decades earlier. Others documented neighboring farms losing crops because nearby creeks had dried almost completely. Yet the maple farm appeared only briefly before disappearing from later records altogether. "Looks like someone stopped updating information about the property," Owen admitted. "I've never noticed that before." Margaret traced the hillside with her finger. "Is there an older map?" Owen smiled. "There might be." He disappeared into a storage room and returned carrying a large tube sealed with a faded county label. Carefully unrolling its contents, he revealed a hand-drawn hydrology map prepared many decades earlier. Unlike the modern surveys, this one showed something remarkable. A thin blue line began beneath the eastern slope of the maple farm before splitting into several narrow channels that no longer appeared on current maps. One line passed directly beneath the old sugar house. Margaret stared at it in silence. "That can't be right," Owen murmured. "If this map is accurate, there used to be an underground water source running beneath your property." "Used to be?" Margaret asked quietly. Owen hesitated. "Or at least, that's what everyone believed." He made a high-quality copy of the map for her before rolling the fragile original back into its tube. As she thanked him and prepared to leave, he added one final thought. "Old maps usually tell us where water once flowed." He paused before smiling thoughtfully. "Sometimes they also tell us where people wanted others to stop looking." Late that afternoon, Margaret returned to the farmhouse carrying the copied map beneath one arm. She spread it across the kitchen table beside her coffee mug and studied every line carefully. The blue markings crossed the property exactly where she had heard the mysterious sound the previous evening. As the sun began to set, another familiar vehicle turned into the driveway. Sarah stepped out, her overnight bag slung over one shoulder. She hugged her mother tightly before looking around the neglected farm. "Mom," she said gently, "please tell me this isn't where you're planning to stay." Margaret smiled warmly. "Come inside. There's something I want to show you." Sarah followed her mother into the farmhouse, setting her overnight bag beside the door with the careful quietness of someone trying not to show fear. The room was cleaner than Margaret had found it, but no amount of sweeping could hide the cracked plaster, the camping stove on the counter, or the blankets folded where a proper bed should have been. Sarah looked around once, then turned back to her mother. "You've been sleeping here?" Margaret placed the copied hydrology map on the kitchen table. "It's better than the car." Sarah's face tightened. "Mom, that isn't reassuring." Margaret understood the worry in her daughter's voice. Sarah had spent years caring for strangers as a nurse, yet seeing her own mother in a half-abandoned farmhouse was clearly harder than either of them expected. "I know it doesn't look like much," Margaret said gently, "but I think there's more to this place than people remember." She showed Sarah the old map, the blue line passing beneath the sugar house, and explained what Ranger Owen had found in the county records. Sarah listened without interrupting, though her expression remained doubtful. "A hidden water source doesn't fix the roof," she finally said, "or give you heat, or make this safe." "No," Margaret admitted, "but it gives me a reason not to walk away yet." The next morning, after a quiet breakfast of toast and instant coffee, Margaret carried her tools to the old sugar house. Sarah followed, partly to help, and partly, Margaret suspected, to make sure the building did not fall on her. Sunlight slipped through gaps in the tin roof, illuminating the dusty evaporator, rusted hooks, and long tables where maple sap had once been boiled and bottled. Margaret began clearing broken crates from the far wall, while Sarah swept leaves away from the center aisle. The practical work settled the tension between them. For a while, they spoke only when passing tools or warning each other about loose boards. As the floor slowly emerged, Margaret noticed how carefully the building had once been arranged. Old pipes ran along one wall before disappearing beneath warped planks. Wooden shelves still held glass bottles clouded with age. Near the back, a narrow office door stood half-hidden behind a fallen rack. "There," Margaret said. Inside the small office, the air was dry and still. A desk leaned beneath the window, its surface buried under brittle papers. Sarah helped lift a broken shelf away while Margaret opened the drawers one by one. Most held receipts, old labels, and mouse-chewed order forms. Then, in the bottom drawer, Margaret found a stack of black and white photographs tied with faded blue ribbon. She carried them into the light. The first showed the farm alive with people. Families stood among wagons loaded with sap buckets. Children held paper cups of syrup. A banner stretched across the sugar house door. Maple Festival. Margaret turned to another photograph, then another. The same building, the same grove, but full of laughter and motion. Sarah leaned closer. "It was beautiful." Margaret smiled sadly. "Eleanor remembered it exactly." Beneath the photographs lay a thick notebook with a cracked brown cover. The first pages contained production records, gallons of sap collected, cords of wood burned, bottles filled, names of buyers. But halfway through, the entries changed. The numbers became shorter. Notes appeared in the margins. North line weak. No surface flow. Do not mention lower source. Margaret paused over that sentence. Sarah read it too, and her doubt gave way to unease. Lower source. Margaret turned more pages. The handwriting grew tighter near the end, as though written in haste. Several pages had been removed, but a folded envelope remained tucked inside the back cover. It was addressed to no one. Margaret opened it carefully. The letter inside was only a few lines long. If the farm has gone silent, someone has forgotten the reason it was protected. Water kept this valley alive when pride would have let it die. But those who search with greed will ruin what mercy preserved. Margaret swallowed and read the final sentence aloud. "If you are looking for the source, do not look for the stream." Sarah stared at the page. Outside, the sugar house creaked softly in the wind, and beneath the floorboards, Margaret imagined she heard the faintest whisper of water. Margaret stayed inside the sugar house long after Sarah returned to the farmhouse. The letter lay open on the old desk, its final warning pulling her eyes back again and again. Do not look for the stream. Outside, every story she had heard about the farm pointed toward a dried spring, a missing water source, and a valley that had once depended on something no one wanted to name. But if the stream was not the answer, then the real clue had to be somewhere else. By morning, Sarah needed to return to the city for work. She stood beside her car with both hands tucked into her jacket pockets, studying her mother with the same worried expression she had worn since arriving. "Promise me you won't go crawling under buildings by yourself," she said. Margaret smiled. "I promise to be careful." "That's not the same thing." Margaret hugged her tightly. "I know this place scares you." Sarah held on a moment longer. "It doesn't scare me because it's old. It scares me because you look hopeful, and I don't want it to hurt you." After Sarah drove away, the farm felt quieter than before. Margaret folded the letter into its envelope, placed it with the photographs and production notebook, then drove into town to visit Eleanor Brooks. The elderly woman welcomed her into a warm sitting room that smelled faintly of cinnamon and furniture polish. When Margaret showed her the Maple Festival photographs, Eleanor's face softened at once. "Oh," she whispered, "there we are." Her thin finger touched a little girl standing near a wagon, holding a tin cup. "That was me." Margaret sat beside her. "Do you remember the drought years?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Everyone remembers hunger differently. Children remember adults whispering." She gazed at the photograph for a long moment. Wells went low. Creeks thinned to mud. Farms failed all around us. But this farm kept going. Eleanor nodded slowly. "And not just this farm. My father used to leave empty barrels near the back road. In the morning, they would be full." Margaret leaned closer. "Full of water?" "Sometimes water, sometimes sap, sometimes both, depending on the season. No one asked questions because everyone was proud. Accepting help is easier when no one forces you to admit you need it." Margaret thought of the letter's words. Water kept this valley alive when pride would have let it die. Did people know where it came from? Eleanor shook her head. Not children. Maybe not even most adults. But I remember my mother saying the Turners and the first owners of your farm knew how to keep quiet better than anyone. On the drive back, Margaret stopped by Eli Turner's small house near the edge of the woods. He was stacking firewood beside the porch when she arrived. She told him what Eleanor had remembered. Eli listened without surprise. "My father used to leave at night," he said. "I thought he was checking taps or bringing supplies to neighbors." "Was he carrying water?" Eli set another log onto the pile. "Sometimes he'd come back with wet boots, even in dry weather." Once I asked where he'd been. What did he say? He said, "Some gifts dry up the moment people fight over them." Margaret showed him the letter from the notebook. Eli read it slowly, his thumb resting near the final line. "Do not look for the stream," he murmured. "That sounds like something old Samuel Whitcomb would write." "Who was he?" "The man who built the sugar house. Folks said he understood this hillside better than any surveyor." Eli handed the letter back. "If he didn't want people looking for a stream, he meant the water wasn't where eyes expected it to be." Back at the farm, Margaret walked the maple grove with new attention. She was no longer searching for a visible creek or wet ground. She studied the trees instead, remembering Eleanor's stories and Eli's warning. Near the northern rows, she found the first mark carved into a trunk, a small maple leaf, almost hidden beneath rough bark. Several yards away, another tree carried the same symbol. Then another. The marks were faint, old, and easy to miss unless someone was already looking. Margaret followed them slowly through the grove. The marked trees did not form a straight line. They curved around the slope, passing above the abandoned stone channel, then bending back toward the sugar house. Each symbol appeared at the same height, carefully cut long ago and softened by decades of growth. The path felt deliberate, like a message written in living wood. As the afternoon light faded, the final marked tree stood near a patch of heavy leaves behind the sugar house. Margaret knelt and brushed them aside. Beneath the leaves lay a flat stone unlike the others around it. Its edges were too square, its surface too level. And carved into the center was the same small maple leaf she had seen on the trees. She pressed both hands against the stone and felt a faint coolness rising through it, though the ground around her was dry. Margaret knelt beside the flat stone until the evening light began fading across the maple grove. She brushed away the last layer of damp leaves and traced the carved maple leaf at its center with her fingertips. The stone was cooler than the ground surrounding it, but nothing else seemed unusual. She pushed against one edge with both hands. It didn't move. The slab was far heavier than she had expected. Rather than forcing it alone, she covered it with loose branches to mark the spot and returned to the farmhouse before dark. The following morning, Eli arrived carrying a long steel pry bar in the back of his pickup. Margaret met him beside the sugar house and quietly led him to the hidden stone. He studied the carving for a few moments before nodding. "I've walked past this place for years," he admitted. "Never noticed it." Together they cleared away more soil from the edges. The stone had been fitted carefully into the hillside, almost disappearing beneath decades of leaves and moss. Eli slid the pry bar underneath one corner while Margaret steadied it with both hands. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded with a slow groan. The slab lifted just enough for them to shift it aside. Beneath it lay a narrow stone-lined opening no wider than a storage pit. Margaret leaned forward with her flashlight. The chamber extended only a few feet below ground. It was empty. No boxes, no tools, no records. Only smooth stone walls and a floor covered with dry dirt. She climbed carefully into the shallow space and examined every corner. Nothing had been left behind. No markings appeared on the walls. No hidden compartments revealed themselves beneath the loose soil. After nearly an hour of searching, she climbed back out and sat quietly beside the opening. "Maybe someone found it years ago," she said softly. Eli rested the pry bar against the tree. "Maybe." His voice carried more uncertainty than agreement. They replaced the stone exactly as they had found it. As disappointing as the discovery felt, Margaret refused to believe every clue had led only to an empty chamber. The carved trees, the letter, the abandoned water channel, and the old notebook all pointed towards something larger than a forgotten storage pit. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove to the ranger station carrying photographs of the carved stone and the underground chamber. Owen studied them with interest before walking into the archive room once again. "Let's try something different," he said. Several minutes later, he returned holding a large aerial photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. A handwritten label identified it as 1958. They spread it across the table beneath the overhead lights. Unlike the modern landscape Margaret now knew so well, The old photograph showed the maple farm during its busiest years. Trucks stood beside the sugar house. Long rows of sap buckets hung from healthy trees. Workers moved between buildings as tiny shadows frozen in time. Owen pointed toward the sugar house. "Notice anything?" Margaret leaned closer. A dark line crossed the ground beside the building. At first, she assumed it was a shadow, but the angle seemed wrong. The line continued beneath the rear wall before disappearing entirely. "That's not on the current property," she said. Owen nodded. "No." He retrieved a transparent overlay showing today's survey. The mysterious line no longer existed. "Could it have been the old water channel?" Margaret asked. Owen slowly shook his head. The channel ran outside. He tapped the photograph again. Whatever this was, it went underneath the sugar house. Margaret compared the old image with her copy hydrology map. The hidden blue line from the historical survey passed beneath almost exactly the same location. Neither document proved anything by itself, but together they suggested the same possibility. Something important had once existed beneath the building. Owen carefully rolled the photograph back into its protective sleeve. "I've never noticed that feature before," he admitted. Margaret smiled faintly. Neither had anyone else. Driving back to the farm, she replayed every clue in her mind. The warning not to search for the stream, the healthy maple trees, the carved symbols leading first to the stone, and now, perhaps, back toward the sugar house. As the evening sun settled behind the hills, she walked slowly around the old building, studying its weathered foundation. Near one corner, she stopped. Kneeling beside the stone wall, she placed her hand against the cool earth. For just an instant, she thought she felt the faintest breath of cool air escaping through a narrow crack hidden between two foundation stones. Margaret remained kneeling beside the sugar house foundation, one hand pressed against the narrow crack between two stones. The cool air she thought she had felt vanished almost as quickly as it came. For several minutes, she stayed perfectly still, waiting for it to return. Nothing moved except a few dry leaves skittering across the ground behind her. The practical part of her mind told her old foundations shifted, stones settled, and cold pockets formed beneath buildings all the time. Yet the photograph from 1958, the hydrology map, and the warning in the letter would not leave her alone. Whatever had once passed beneath this building had left traces everywhere except in plain sight. She marked the foundation stone with a piece of chalk, then returned to the farmhouse before darkness made the uneven ground dangerous. The next morning, while she was clearing brush near the old stone channel, a dark sedan rolled into the driveway. A neatly dressed man stepped out carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. Margaret recognized him at once from the foreclosure paperwork. Though he had never been unkind to her, Richard Collins, the bank manager, closed the car door and looked around the farm with professional concern. "Mrs. Hale," he said, approaching carefully, "I hope this isn't a bad time." Margaret wiped her hands on her work pants. "I'm surprised to see you here." "I heard you purchased the old maple property." His eyes moved over the leaning sugar house, the patched roof, and the overgrown hillside. "I wanted to make sure you understood your options." Margaret gave a small smile. Options usually arrive before a person loses her home. Richard accepted the words without argument. "That's fair." He opened the folder and removed a business card. "There are buyers interested in land parcels outside town, not farmers, developers. They wouldn't care that the place no longer produces. Given what you paid, you could walk away with a meaningful profit." Margaret looked toward the maple trees. The wind moved through their leaves with a sound like distant rain. A month earlier, the offer might have seemed like rescue. Now it felt like being asked to abandon someone who had just begun speaking. "Thank you," she said, "but I'm not selling." Richard seemed unsurprised, only saddened. "This property will require money, labor, and time." "I know. And if the old water rumors are what brought you here, I should tell you people have chased that story before." Margaret studied him. "What people?" He hesitated. "Surveyors, buyers, curious locals. Most found nothing except dry stone and disappointment." He handed her the card anyway. "If you change your mind, call me." After he left, Margaret stood alone beside the channel. His visit had stirred doubts she had been trying to ignore. She was 61, sleeping in a barely repaired farmhouse, following clues carved into trees. Sarah would call it dangerous hope. Maybe it was. But hope had carried her farther than fear had. That afternoon, Eli arrived with a coil of rope and a covered dish of stew. Margaret told him about Richard's offer while they ate on the porch steps. Eli listened, then looked toward the sugar house. "Samuel Whitcomb had offers too," he said. Margaret lowered her spoon. "The man who built it?" Eli nodded. "During the drought, outsiders came wanting to buy water rights all through the valley. Most folks were desperate enough to listen. Samuel refused every one of them." "Why?" "My father said Samuel believed some things shouldn't belong to whoever had the deepest pockets." Eli's voice softened. "He wasn't rich, not by any measure. But when neighbors needed water, he found a way to share it quietly. When men came asking how, he sent them away." Margaret thought of the line in the letter about greed ruining what mercy preserved. "Did your father know where the source was?" "Maybe part of it." Eli looked down at his hands. "He once told me the farm was built over a promise, not just land. I was too young to understand." Later, with Eli nearby, Margaret returned to the foundation stone she had marked. They cleared away weeds and loose soil from the base of the sugar house. The stones there were larger than those along the rest of the wall, fitted tightly but not evenly. Margaret tapped one with the wooden handle of her trowel. Solid. She tapped the next. Solid again. Then she struck the marked stone. A dull, hollow sound answered from within the wall. Eli looked at her sharply. Margaret tapped it again, softer this time. The same empty echo came back. Together they brushed dirt from the crack beneath it. As the last clump of soil fell away, a thin breath of cool air slipped out against Margaret's fingers. Steady this time, carrying the faint damp smell of stone and hidden water. The cool breath slipping through the foundation made Margaret forget every doubt she had carried since buying the farm. She kept her fingers near the crack, feeling the steady draft move against her skin. It was not the dry air of an empty crawl space. It smelled faintly of damp stone, moss, and something clean she could not name. Eli crouched beside her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "There's space behind that wall," he said. Margaret nodded, though her throat had tightened. "Can we move the stone?" Eli studied the foundation carefully. "Not without care. This wall has held up the sugar house for a long time. Pull the wrong piece and we could do damage." That was enough to slow her excitement. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked cautiously, removing only loose soil and clearing the base of the wall so they could see how the stones fit together. The hollow stone was not supporting the main corner beam. It appeared to be part of a narrow sealed section added after the original foundation was built. The difference was subtle, but once Eli pointed it out, Margaret could see it clearly. The mortar around that one area was smoother, newer, and slightly lighter than the rest. Someone had closed an opening on purpose. By evening, they decided not to continue until Sarah could return and Owen could look at the structure. Margaret did not argue, for once. Patience felt less like waiting and more like respect. She called Sarah that night and explained only enough to make her daughter insist on coming back the next morning. "You found air under a building and thought I wouldn't drive out?" Sarah said over the phone. "Mom, please don't touch anything until I get there." Margaret smiled into the quiet kitchen. "I won't." Sarah arrived shortly after sunrise with work gloves, a first aid kit, and the stern expression she used with stubborn patience. Owen came an hour later, carrying a hard hat, a flashlight, and a small inspection mirror. Together, the four of them gathered beside the marked foundation stone. Owen examined the wall first, tapping several places and checking the beams inside the sugar house. "Eli's right," he said. "This section was sealed later. If we remove only these two smaller stones, the structure should remain stable." Sarah looked at her mother. "Should?" Owen gave an apologetic smile. Old buildings don't offer guarantees. They worked slowly. Eli loosened the old mortar with a chisel, while Owen steadied the surrounding stones. Margaret and Sarah carried away each broken piece in small buckets. It took nearly 2 hours before the first stone shifted free. Cool air flowed out stronger at once. The second stone came loose with a soft scrape, revealing a dark opening barely wide enough for a person to crouch through. No one moved for a moment. Margaret shone her flashlight inside. The beam caught rough rock walls descending beneath the sugar house. Not a cellar, not a man-made room, a natural passage, partly widened by hand, sloping into darkness. From somewhere below came the unmistakable sound of running water, clearer now than any night before. Sarah stepped closer to Margaret. "You were right," she whispered, and the simple words nearly broke something open in her mother's chest. They tied a rope to the nearest support beam and entered carefully. Owen first, then Margaret, with Sarah close behind. Eli remained above to watch the opening. The passage was narrow but passable. Stone steps had been cut into the slope long ago, worn smooth by feet that had walked them many times. The air grew cooler with each step. Moisture glistened on the walls. Margaret touched one rock face and felt it damp beneath her palm. "Someone used this often," Owen said, pointing to old tool marks along the wall. The passage turned gently under the sugar house, following the same hidden line shown in the 1958 photograph. The sound of water grew louder, no longer a whisper, but a steady voice moving through stone. Margaret's knees trembled, partly from the descent and partly from the feeling that she was walking into the heart of every unanswered question the farm had given her. Sarah reached for her hand in the dimness. Margaret held it tightly. At the bottom, the passage widened into a small rock chamber. Owen raised his flashlight. The beam swept across damp stone, a low ceiling, and a narrow channel carved along the floor. Then the light caught movement. Clear water slipped through the channel, running quietly from a dark opening in the rock and disappearing beneath the far wall. Margaret stepped forward slowly. The water was real. It had been flowing beneath the farm all along. Owen moved the flashlight toward the source, and the beam flashed across a wider pool beyond the rocks, bright and glassy in the darkness. Margaret stopped at the edge of the chamber, unable to speak. As the hidden spring shimmered under the light, Margaret stood motionless at the edge of the underground pool, while the beam of Owen's flashlight shimmered across the crystal-clear water. It flowed silently from a narrow opening in the rock before disappearing beneath the far wall into the stone channel that had once carried life across the farm. There was no rush of water, no roaring underground river, only a steady, gentle spring that had clearly never stopped flowing. Sarah slowly knelt beside the pool and dipped her fingertips into the water. "It's cold," she whispered. Owen crouched beside her, watching the current. "And perfectly clear." Eli joined them a moment later, removing his cap as though he had entered a church rather than a cave. For several seconds, no one spoke. The hidden spring explained everything the surface had hidden. The healthy maple trees, the carefully built stone channel, the warnings passed from one generation to another. Margaret looked around the chamber. Someone had shaped parts of it by hand. Flat stones formed a narrow walkway beside the water. Old wooden supports, blackened with age, still reinforced one section of the ceiling. This place had not been discovered by accident. It had been cared for. As Owen examined the rock wall nearest the spring, his flashlight reflected from something metallic resting inside a shallow niche carved above the waterline. "Margaret," he called softly. She stepped closer. Nestled safely inside the recess sat a small rectangular tin box coated with a thin layer of mineral deposits. Unlike the metal objects left above ground, this one had been protected from rust by its sheltered position. Margaret carefully lifted it from the niche. It was surprisingly light. The lid resisted at first before opening with a quiet snap. Inside lay a folded oilcloth package tied with faded cotton string. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she untied the knot. Within the oilcloth rested several sheets of neatly folded paper, still dry after decades beneath the earth. She unfolded the first page carefully. The handwriting matched the notes she had found in the production book inside the sugar house. Samuel Whitcomb. She began reading aloud. "If you have reached this place, then you have already learned that the stream people searched for never disappeared. We simply stopped letting the world believe it existed." Margaret paused, then continued. "During the Great Drought, this spring became the difference between life and ruin. Neighbor after neighbor came to us after dark because pride would not let them ask in daylight. We filled barrels, buckets, and wagons without recording names or expecting payment." Eli quietly lowered his head. Margaret turned to the second page. "Many advised us to sell the water rights. They promised wealth beyond anything a maple farm could earn. But water that belongs to everyone should never belong to the highest bidder." Sarah wiped away a tear before Margaret finished reading. The final page contained one last message. "If this spring survives beyond my lifetime, let it remain protected. Share its blessing, never its ownership." Silence settled across the chamber. The only sound came from the water continuing its endless journey through stone. Owen finally spoke. "Now I understand why the record stopped." Margaret looked toward him. "Someone protected the secret." He nodded. "If this location had appeared on official surveys, investors would have claimed it decades ago." Carefully, Margaret folded the letter and returned it to the oilcloth. They climbed back to the surface, carrying only the small tin box. Before sunset, Owen contacted the county historical office, explaining only that a significant historical document had been found. He deliberately said nothing about the exact location of the spring. News spread quickly that Margaret had uncovered evidence explaining the old maple farm's remarkable survival during the drought. Eleanor arrived the following afternoon. Though age forced her to walk slowly, she insisted on reading Samuel Whitcomb's letter herself. When she reached the final page, she smiled through quiet tears. "My mother was right," she whispered. "No one ever knew who filled those barrels." Eli stood beside the porch railing overlooking the maple grove. "Now we do." Margaret looked across the healthy trees glowing beneath the autumn sun. She no longer saw an abandoned farm purchased with her last $200. She saw a place built upon quiet generosity. As evening settled over the hillside, she unfolded Samuel's letter one final time. At the bottom of the last page, beneath his signature, one sentence had been written in smaller letters, almost as an afterthought. "The next keeper of this spring will know in their heart what must never be sold." By the next morning, Margaret knew there were two choices before her. She could treat the hidden spring like a miracle that belonged to her alone, or she could honor the reason Samuel Whitcomb had protected it for so many years. The answer came before breakfast, while she stood in the sugar house doorway watching mist lift from the maple grove. She had arrived on this farm homeless, frightened, and almost empty of hope. The spring had not saved her by promising wealth. It had saved her by giving her something worth protecting. Owen returned with two members of the county historical office, and together they reviewed Samuel's letter. The old production notebook, the photographs, and the sealed passage beneath the sugar house. Margaret agreed to preserve the spring's exact location and refused every suggestion that might turn it into a commercial attraction. "This water kept people alive because it was shared quietly," she said. "I won't be the one who sells it loudly." Owen smiled as if he had expected nothing else. Over the following weeks, the farm changed in small, steady ways. Volunteers repaired the sugar house roof properly. Eli helped restore the old evaporator, not to hide the past beneath something new, but to let visitors see how maple syrup had once been made there. Eleanor brought more memories than photographs, describing music, wagons, children with sticky fingers, and neighbors who arrived with empty barrels but left with enough courage to face another week. Sarah began visiting every few days after her hospital shifts. At first, she came to check on her mother. Then she stayed to sort documents, clean shelves, and label copies of the photographs found in the office. One evening, as they swept the sugar house floor together, Sarah paused and looked toward the maple trees glowing in late sunlight. "I used to think you needed rescuing from this place," she said. Margaret leaned on her broom. "And now," Sarah smiled, "now I think maybe it rescued you first." By spring, the farm no longer looked forgotten. The farmhouse had a safe roof, a working stove, and curtains Sarah had sewn from old cotton fabric. The sugar house became a small community room where the history of the drought, the Maple Festival, and Samuel Whitcomb's quiet promise were displayed through copies of letters and photographs. The original letter was placed in a weatherproof archival box inside a locked cabinet, protected from damp air, but close to the building that had guarded its secret for generations. Margaret kept the tin box beside it. She did not display the spring itself. Instead, with Owen's guidance, a simple hand pump was installed outside the sugar house, drawing only a careful, limited amount of water from a protected line. A small wooden sign beside it read, "Take what you need. Waste nothing." When the first Maple Festival returned, the whole valley seemed to wake with it. Families walked beneath the trees. Children carried paper cups of warm syrup. Eli demonstrated how sap buckets once hung from the trunks, and Eleanor sat near the entrance telling anyone who would listen how the old festival had sounded when she was a girl. Richard Collins came too, standing awkwardly near the porch until Margaret invited him in for coffee. He looked around at the restored room and the people laughing outside. "I'm glad you didn't sell," he admitted. Margaret smiled. So am I. Near sunset, Eli approached her with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was an old wooden dipper, worn smooth along the handle. "My father kept this," he said. "He said it belonged to the people who knew when to give and when to stay silent." Margaret accepted it with both hands. The wood was light, but the meaning felt heavier than anything she had carried from her old life. "Are you sure?" Eli nodded. "You're the keeper now." Sarah stood beside her mother as children lined up at the pump, laughing when the first cold splash hit their cups. The water flowed clear and bright, not as a spectacle, not as a fortune, but as a reminder. Margaret watched them drink and thought of the nights she had slept in her station wagon, believing she had reached the end of her story. She had bought the farm for $200 because she had nowhere else to go. But the land had given her more than shelter. It had given her a purpose rooted deeper than fear, older than loss, and stronger than the voices that had called the place worthless. As evening settled over the hillside, maple leaves rustled above the restored sugar house, and the hidden spring continued to flow beneath the stone, just as it always had. Margaret stood among neighbors who no longer saw her as a homeless woman who had made a foolish bid at auction. They saw her as the person who had listened when the forgotten farm finally spoke. And for the first time in a very long while, Margaret Hale did not feel like someone trying to survive the ruins of what she had lost. She felt at home. Late that evening, after the last visitors had gone home, Margaret walked alone to the old sugar house. The festival laughter had faded into the distance. Only the sound of wind moving gently through the maple trees remained. She unlocked the small cabinet where Samuel Whitcomb's original letter rested inside its protective case. Carefully, she unfolded the final page one more time. She had read those words dozens of times, yet one sentence never stopped speaking to her. Protect the spring, but never forget why it was hidden. Margaret quietly closed her eyes. For weeks, she had believed the hidden spring was the farm's greatest secret. She was wrong. The spring had never been the secret. The people were. The water itself wasn't rare. It was the choice to share it without asking for recognition. That was the miracle. Samuel Whitcomb could have sold the spring. He could have become the wealthiest farmer in the valley. Instead, he chose something far more difficult. He remained anonymous. He allowed other families to keep their dignity. No newspaper ever praised him. No monument carried his name. No history book celebrated what he had done. And somehow, that made his kindness even greater. Margaret looked through the open doorway toward the rows of maple trees glowing beneath the setting sun. Months earlier, she had arrived believing she had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her savings, even her future. She thought buying an abandoned maple farm for $200 had been the desperate decision of a woman with nowhere left to go. Now she understood something entirely different. She had never bought the farm. The farm had found her. Not because she knew how to make maple syrup, not because she understood hidden springs, but because she understood what Samuel had always hoped the next caretaker would understand. Some blessings grow smaller when they're owned, but they grow larger when they're shared. Margaret folded the letter carefully and returned it to its protective case. Then she stepped outside one final time. Children were filling their bottles from the small hand pump. Parents laughed nearby. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to one another were sharing food beneath the maple trees. Nobody was thinking about the hidden spring beneath their feet. They were simply enjoying the life it quietly continued to give. Margaret smiled. That was exactly how Samuel would have wanted it. The greatest treasures are rarely the ones we uncover. They're the ones that keep giving long after we've chosen not to keep them for ourselves. As twilight settled across the valley, the hidden spring continued flowing beneath the old maple farm, unseen by most, unchanged by time, just as it always had. And somewhere deep below the roots of those towering maples, the water carried forward a promise that could never be measured in dollars. That kindness, when given freely, never truly disappears. It simply finds its way to the next person who needs it most.